down here you see the Bonneville Salt Flats. We followed the overflow of mighty Lake Bonneville right up here through Red Rock Pass, and then how it spilled out and carved out, over-deepened the pre-existing Snake River Valley, flowed up here, and then we came right up here to Lewiston and Clarkston, and we stopped at the Tammany Bar. And we found two different, we found two different sedimentary regimes. We saw a darker colored grayish, much coarser set of sediments that had very steep foresets, very prominent steep foresets, right? Then we saw on top of that, we saw a much finer grained, buff colored sedimentary layer. It wasn't quite as thick. It didn't have sweeping foresets. What it did have, though, was undulations that you could see very clearly. And I pointed out there was a transition in the type of layering, a type of strata, from quite level to where you then saw much more rippling. And I pointed out that this was the level was the incoming, because it was at the almost at the distal point of its backflood. And you can see as it's moving closer and closer, it's slowing down, and then it stops, and then it begins to flow back out as the tributary valley drains. So what we saw there was the flat area where you had the very slow, sluggish. Then we saw the ripples where the current had reversed and was now flowing back out. And this is exposed in that Tammany Creek that gives its name to the gravel pit. Okay, so now if you go up into this area up here, this is called the Columbia Basalt Plateau. And it is basalt, which is an extruded lava rock. It forms under molten circumstances. It's igneous in origin, but unlike, say, the granites, it flows out and solidifies, crystallizes in the open air. Right, so its crystalline structure becomes very different because it cools fast. So because of the fast cooling, the crystals don't have time to grow really big, so you can see macro scale crystals like you can often see in granites and andesites and things like that. But what you have is a finer grained rock, and because of the way it cools, it can in its composition, whether it's underwater, whether it's in the air, because if it flows out underground, some of it is going to be in lakes and rivers, right? And so it's going to form what's called pillow basalt, and then you have columnar basalt. You'll see some pictures of it here in a minute. And you have Hackley basalt. Those are the two most prevalent kinds, and they're very different. And we don't need to get into that, but it's mostly just the regime under which they crystallize, and also the composition of the distinct basalt flows, right, that you have these. And so that becomes one way that you can differentiate between basalt flows, and you will see pictures of that here. Okay, so this whole area here is a basalt plateau, and it's surrounded by mountains. Here's the Rocky Mountains over here, right, and here's the coastal mountains right here, and the Columbia River comes right down through here and goes through those mountains, and then it turns north and flows out to the ocean right here. That's the Columbia, right? So the Snake and the Columbia meet right there at that spot where that particular outcrop is. Okay, so now where did this basalt come from? Well, it came from this area right here. And that area right there has a lot of fault lines and fractures, which are called feeder dikes. And what that is that's the zone where the lava extruded from below, from down in the mantle, right? However, where it is now is not where it was when it began this bleed out, if you want to think of it that way. It started around 17 million years ago, and it was like a suppurating wound for about 10 million years. But as time went on, the amount of lava, basalt lava, flowing out, extruding from that wound, dissipated, and then finally the last gasp was pretty much about 6 million years ago, right? That's when the last layer of basaltic rock formed. However, this area was not where it is now when this started. In fact, you can trace its pathway back along the Snake River Plain, right here, like this, right up here, there's Yellowstone Lake, right there, okay? That's where it was. So underneath, there's a deep-seated mantle plume rising up from deep down, from below the lithosphere. Rises up, and you can think of it rising up almost like a blowtorch or something, and the plate is moving over it. So as the plate is moving over, it takes roughly 10 million years from where it started out to where it is now. The plate is moving over it. Well, now this tremendous heat from below is coming up and basically melting the surface, and it's flowing out. So picture that you've got this area right here, and you back it up to here, and now you're at 17 million years ago, and over 10 million years, the plate moved in this big arc, and here it is right here, the area where all of this basalt extruded out and flooded this whole area of basalt. Okay, now fast forward to about 2.5 million years ago, at the beginning of the Pleistocene. That's when the glacial epoch really got underway. And you started having this alternating glacial and interglacial cycle. I believe we looked at some of that, didn't we?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. So then for 2.5 million years, there was this oscillating cycle. Sometimes, and all of these mountains here were glaciated, right? Down solidly. You see where Lake Pend Oreille is right here. Mm-hmm. Pend Oreille was under an ice lobe that reached all the way down to Spokane, which is right about where my cursor is. So you can go here. It's about 50 miles from here up to here. And then all of this up here, I'll show you a graphic in a minute. Flathead Lake over here in western Montana was also the terminus. It was an ice lobe that ended right there. And we explained, I believe, that do you remember what moraine is?
I don't.
Moraine, no. Okay. Moraine, good for you. I like that when you're right there on top of things looking it up. Moraine is the material that's produced by the heavy glaciers shearing their way over the land, pulverizing and grinding everything up, right? So when we talk about moraine, there's different kinds of moraine. Terminal moraine occurs at the end of the snout of a glacier. Medial moraine is like a layer of this material, gravelly material. We usually call it till. It used to be called drift back in the old days, but till, if you have two valleys coming together and they're both glaciated, look at this. If the glaciers come together like my hands and then they're flowing down gradient, and they both got lateral moraine. So lateral moraine is along the sides. So if the glacier is grinding its way through a mountain valley, it's shearing off material from the walls. That becomes lateral moraine. So if you have two glaciers meeting together and there's lateral moraine, then they flow and become one glacier. So now you've got this big, thick, double thick layer of lateral moraine, but it's now within a coherent glacier because you had two separate tongues, came together, and then they sort of merged. So now down the middle of that bigger glacier, you've got this layer, thick layer of pulverized material. We call that, what did I just say? Lateral moraine.
Yeah.
Yes, moraine. It's medial moraine.
Oh, yeah.
Medial. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Then we also have recessional moraine. Now, you got a picture. This oversimplified way of thinking about it is that as the glacier's moving across the land, it's just like acting like a bulldozer, right? Which is part of the process. But more complex than that is the fact that the material, like even the lateral moraine, can be incorporated into the body of the glacier itself. The substrate material, the till below, can get worked up into the mass of the glacier. So if you were to take a cross section of the glacier, it wouldn't be nice, clean ice. It would be very dirty ice. And then there'd be layers in it where it's just almost like total, like gravel and boulders and sand and, right. So And then the whole glacier is not necessarily moving all at the same rate. Now, when we're talking about glaciers, let's think about two glaciers in two states, living and dead. Living glacier has a zone of accumulation at the top of the glacier and a zone of ablation at the bottom. The material's accumulating up in the top, becoming incorporated into the glacier because you have layers of snowfall building up, layer after layer, year after year, and then eventually after about 80 to 100 years, the snow has piled up enough that there's pressure on the bottom layers, the layers that are 80 to 100 years old, and it converts it into a crystalline type of intermediary between ice and water. It's called firn, F-I-R-N. Then after another century or two, with more pressure building up, it actually becomes glacier ice, right? Now, it forms a layer. You can go in there and you can count those layers. And those layers just are like almost like tree rings. You can count annual layers, right? Because you'll have like heavy snowfall. You may even have a little bit of melting. Let's go back to this image here. Okay, so you can see that if you look carefully, you're going to see some darker traces over some lighter surrounding area. We're going to zoom in so you can see what that is. Now, what's interesting is if we look here, follow my cursor, this is the Columbia River coming here, and then it bends north, and it goes all the way up here into British Columbia. That's where its headwaters are. So you know that if the glacier came down all the way to this line right here, it totally covered Pend Oreille, it totally covered Flathead. So this is thick glacier. Once you get up in here, it's thousands of feet thick. And the only thing you're going to see is the very tops of the mountains peeking through, like it might be a mile and a half thick glaciers, filling all of those mountain valleys, that you could go up there and, highways drive through them. Now, you hike, you can camp, there's lakes galore. They were filled with ice, thousands of feet thick. And not long ago. This is the late glacial maximum, right? This is sort of a artistic depiction of the late glacial maximum. Have you seen this before?
I've seen this picture, yes.
Yeah, it's a good one because it really kind of shows you had the Laurentide, which was the big ice sheet over eastern North America. Then you had a totally separate ice sheet called the Cordilleran over here. Now, in this picture, this would be the late glacial maximum when the two ice sheets had coalesced. You also had a huge ice sheet called the Fennoscandian that was over northwestern Europe. Okay, now with all of this ice here, sea levels are 400 feet lower. Because where did this ice come from? Well, it's frozen water, isn't it? And where did that water come from? Well, it came out of the oceans. So one of the unanswered questions about this whole ice age business is how exactly does nature go about starting an ice age, a glacial age, from an interglacial age? By what process? I mean, now, in our current climatic regime, we have snow falling over, say, Canada and the northern United States. Where I grew up, sometimes that snow could get many feet thick, right? But then comes spring, usually, what happens? It all melts. It goes back into the hydrosphere. We call this the cryosphere. It's the regime of global ice, the world of ice. The hydrosphere is water, and that could include everything from the oceans to rivers to lakes, creeks, and subterranean water, which we know there's a lot of, right? So that's the hydrosphere. So what happens then is every spring in the northern hemisphere, all that snow turns back to water and flows ultimately into the groundwater or back into the oceans, right? It doesn't stay perennially each year, adding another layer. It melts away, right? But in order to have an ice age, you have to have 1 year where spring doesn't come. Then the next year, spring doesn't come then either. And then the next year, spring doesn't come. And now here's the thing. What it's looking like is when we're trying to sort out what happened here is like, okay, so in the older models, we're thinking 100,000 years or more. You've got this Great Ice Age. Slowly the ice grows and the mass accumulates and the ocean levels go down. Then for 100,000 years, you've got this big, intact, more or less stable ice sheet. And then 50,000 years that it slowly melts away and ocean levels come up. The whole process takes a minimum of 100,000, maybe 150,000 years to complete the sequence. Mm-hmm. Well, now that we have dates, all kinds of dating in hand, we know it ain't that simple. In fact, there could be several interglacials or interstadials. I don't know if you remember, I think we introduced those terms in the last episode. And if I go, here's the big oscillation, full glacial maximum like it was 15, 20,000 years ago, interglacial like it is right now, right?
Right.
Okay, so you have oscillations that might go like this, but then you also have oscillations that might go a little less. So you have a stade or a stadial, which is where it gets colder and the glaciers grow, but they don't get as big as what you're seeing here. Then you might have an interstadial where the glaciers melt away largely, but there's still significant glacier mass left, right? So sea levels then obviously would still be lower than now. So we're using two types. We've got present, that's an interglacial. Late glacial maximum or any glacial maximum would be like 15 to 20,000 years ago, right? So you've got oscillations now that are between those two is extreme, but you've also got oscillations that are less than that. So that's why the reason for two additional terms. So you have glacial maximum, you have interstadial. No, I'm sorry, glacial maximum, interstadial. Stadial. Then you have interglacial and interstadial. So interstadial is still going to be colder than now. And there's still going to be some ice, but not as much as you're seeing right here. Okay, so it helps. If you can learn these terms, it really does help talking about this. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come around just looking on it from the northern hemisphere, the western hemisphere. And in this graphic, you can see pretty clearly the two distinct ice sheets. So you have the Laurentide ice sheet and you have the Cordilleran ice sheet. And again, all of this is the Cordilleran Mountains. It's all part of that whole system, right? And then you can see that there's this line here. And in this graphic, they're pretty much have met each other. Now, between 13 and 15,000 years ago, roughly, there was a warming from the late glacial maximum. In that warming, both the Cordilleran and the Laurentide shrank back to maybe 80 to 90% of their maximum extent. When they did that, this zone between the two ice sheets opened up. If you hear the term the ice-free corridor, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to this zone between the Cordilleran and the Laurentide ice sheets. Now, the Laurentide was centered. There's a major dome pretty much right over Hudson Bay. That was like the thickest part. Some estimates put it up to 2 miles thick right there. I don't know if that's true, but I think we could say that it was at least 1.5 miles thick. So if you're somewhere, in an urban area where you have like here, in Atlanta, you can go down the Bank of America building, I think is 1,200 and some feet high, right? It's the tallest building in Atlanta. So if you go there and you get a good view of I used to take students, there's an overlook where you can kind of see a great skyline view of Atlanta from maybe 5 miles distant or so. You can see the tallest building there, Bank of America building, 1,200 and some feet high. Or maybe it's 1,100 and some. Let's see, 1,200. No, about 1,100. Bank of America building, Atlanta. How tall is it? I'm going to say 1,100 and some feet.
It is 1,023 feet.
Oh, even smaller than, okay, so 1,023 feet. But it's the tallest building in Atlanta. So if you stand there basically and try to imagine 5 of them on top of each other, that's conservatively how thick the ice was, right?
Wow.
That's pretty extraordinary when you start thinking about it. Now, here's the problem. It appears that you get back around 30 to 40,000 years ago, and right up in this area, right up in here, the area of the Laurentide ice sheet, forests were growing. Let that sink in. If there were forests growing, then there was not a big unbroken ice sheet, was there?
No.
Couldn't have been. And that's well dated. What it did was it was assumed that the explanation for glacial and interglacial ages was explained. And that was based upon the Milankovitch forcing, which is the 3 different ways that the Earth solar geometry shifts. Shape of the orbit, the tilt of the axis, the distance, whether it's aphelion or perihelion. Those 3 together will affect sometimes where there's more heat reaching the northern hemisphere, sometimes more heat reaching the southern hemisphere. And sometimes it'll be neutral. The forces will cancel each other out. Other times they can mutually amplify each other. So by carefully working out those cycles, it was assumed that there was enough explanation for how you could go from a glacial to an interglacial if you're talking 50 or 100,000 years. Mm-hmm. However, you're talking 20,000 years, or rather say 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. Well, now you got problems. And the problems are the rates of glaciation and the rates of deglaciation. That's a problem that hasn't been resolved.